Why are we so lazy when it comes to thinking? You're watching Making Sense with Robbie? Let's get started. A ball and a bat cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much do they cost? Most people just guess $1, but the actual price is 5 cents and $1.05. Why it's so common for people to get this question wrong is because an example of what is called a cognitive miser. And so a cognitive miser, in psychology, the human mind is considered to be a cognitive miser due to the tendency of people to think and solve problems in simpler and less effortful ways rather than more sophisticated and more effortful ways, regardless of intelligence. It doesn't matter how smart you are. Everyone is the same in the sense that their mind tries to sort of be cheap, put in less effort, and it tries to solve problems as quickly as possible. But it makes sense, right? Because we want simple, quick thinking. Like if we're faced with a problem, we don't want to have to think about it. We just want to be able to make a snap judgment. We want to be able to sort of look at the situation, solve it, and move on to other things because we're very busy, we have lots going on, and we don't necessarily realize how important some issues are or how important some questions are. And so we just kind of assume that their importance is low. The truth though is that often most of the decisions we need to make during the day aren't actually that significant. So it kind of makes sense at times to be lazy in our thinking, to be quick. Just for some context, a miser is just someone who's cheap or who likes to save their money. And so when it comes to thinking, you can think of thinking as an energy using process. So to be cheap and thinking is just to sort of save your resources so we don't overthink things when we don't have to. But this could also explain why we tend to look to experts, why we tend to ask other people the answers to the questions that we have. It explains why we don't necessarily rely on ourselves or think for ourselves because again, there's always someone else who has a better answer, a simpler answer for us. No doubt thinking is difficult, especially when you don't know how to do it. We learn a certain level of knowledge as we go through school, but we don't necessarily learn things like critical thinking. And I can say from my own personal experience, I studied science at university, and I guess the assumption is that you just kind of pick up on critical thinking on your own. But I was curious about philosophy. I was curious about critical thinking. So I took some courses. They were electives. It's kind of interesting that even as a science student, even as someone who's supposed to star at critical thinking, I didn't get any formal training on it because of my science degree. I had to go out of my way to take classes like that. But you're not taught it unless you're particularly interested in it, unless you find it interesting or something that's worthwhile. Critical thinking is such an important skill, but it's not something that most people learn. With anything in life, we always look for shortcuts. We always look for simple solutions, easy ways. And for the most part, that makes sense, right? Because there's so many things that happen in any single day that to think about every single one of them, that's going to be a waste of time. That's not going to be worthy of your effort. This means that when it comes to simple choices or questions, then we kind of skip and we do quick responses. But when it comes to complicated things, then maybe we kind of, because we have a habit or because we're used to doing lazy thinking or not deep thinking about it, then we kind of use the same heuristics. And so those heuristics work for simple solutions, for simple problems, but they don't necessarily scale. They don't necessarily work in a more complex, complicated world. And this is particularly important these days because there's so much more going on. There's so much more information available now than there's ever been in the past. And so that means that there's more information. That means that there's more circumstances. That means more environmental factors or more of a context where decisions have to be made. And so it becomes more important to have these critical thinking skills, but at the same time, it's because of sort of the ease and simplicity of some of our interactions in our day-to-day lives, we don't even realize that we're kind of being lazy and that we're not thinking about things in a sort of clear and concise and rational way. Unfortunately, these quick and easy ways of thinking, they tend to work. Most of the time it works, but then sometimes it doesn't work. And that's where the problems come because there are those times where we need to make better decisions, where it's more critical and important for us to make good decisions. And so if we don't realize that, if we don't know that, then we kind of miss out on opportunities potentially. There's a difference between low information and high information people on a topic and decision makers. People with high information tend to have lots of context to work with when they're making a decision. So they take what evidence that they can gather, and then they can look at all of the different factors that matter, and then they use that information to make a choice. Whereas low information users don't necessarily realize they have low information, and so they might make decisions in a much easier, quicker way. In the previous video, we talked about the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that was talking about how when people have low knowledge, they don't necessarily realize it, and so they overestimate their skills. But at the same time, same effect is happening with the cognitive miser, with the fact that we are going to be lazy and quick. quick. We don't necessarily realize that we don't have lots of information or enough information, but we still use our simple, quick heuristics to solve problems or come up with solutions. And this comes into play when someone has low information, because they're going to use those same heuristics, those bias, those quick ways of making decisions, but they're going to have less information to do that with. Whereas the high information person is going to have more information. They might or they might not use those cognitive tricks. At least they have more information so they can make better decisions. In both cases, people might be being lazy, but like if you have more information, then your laziness might be more effective. The sort of one of the things though that comes out of this cognitive miser idea is that like people, regardless of intelligence, are lazy thinkers. And so even if you are really smart and even if you have lots of information, you might have the potential to make a better choice, but you don't necessarily make a better choice because again, it falls on laziness. Quick, simple solutions is what we're looking for rather than in-depth solutions. I would take this a step further and I would say that most people aren't trained to think about science. They don't have a scientific background, and so they don't necessarily know how to think with a scientific mindset. But generally speaking, science is complicated, it's difficult, and most people don't have the sort of skills or experience to make decisions in scientific endeavors or dealing with scientific situations. And so they don't have the skills to make good choices in those situations. And so they're more likely to fall into traps. But where this kind of really comes into effect, where this really changes things or has a real significant effect on things is risk assessment. And so it seems like people are pretty bad at risk assessment. They don't know what risk is, or they don't know how to calculate risk, and they might overestimate risk, and which means they'll become fearful. They'll not take action. They'll do things in overly cautious ways. Whereas on the other hand, right, like if someone underestimates risks, then they might do things very dangerously. They might put all of their money into Bitcoin at the top. What's important is that risk is something that we need to be cognizant of, we need to be careful with, but we don't want to be lazy when it comes to assessing risk, because risk can have really big or really small effects, but we never know. And so we want to have sort of good critical reasoning skills when it comes to assessing risk. We don't want to fall into these cognitive miser traps where we allow ourselves to make quick, snap, uneducated or unthinking sort of choices. We don't want to make unthinking choices. We always want to stick to being rational and thinking about things clearly. And we kind of have to avoid that sort of that risk of being lazy, that risk of being quick. And all of this laziness or this processing, it comes down to bias, stereotypes, and heuristics. All of these things contribute to people's thinking or to people's reasoning. Usually though, like you should kind of take the circumstances and think about the circumstances on their own instead of relying on bias and stereotypes. We use or we have bias and stereotypes because we have subconscious evidence that we support those ideas or that we use those ideas to make decisions or to think about things. But like the reality is that you need to step back in any given situation and you need to look at the circumstances. You need to think about it rationally, and you need to not allow yourself or allow your brain to kind of go the lazy route. So my question to you is like, do you really think, or are you a lazy thinker? Are you a cognitive miser who tends to allow yourself to make snap decisions without looking at the evidence, without looking at the circumstances? Let me know in the comments below. If you found this informative or educational, click that like button because I'd really appreciate it. If you're curious about learning how to think about things, but you don't want to be told what to think about them, then click that subscribe button because that's what I'm here for. You've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk next time. Goodbye.